Oh, all right. One of the things that we always do here, because of the nature of this site, is a perquisite for you as donors, is that allows us to, well, kind of requires us to step out of character, to do a sort of behind the scenes. It's also a chance to talk about some things that we can't really talk about in character. And there were two I wanted to mention, and I'm trying to remember. One of them I even told you I wanted to mention. What was your first question? You remember? Was it you? What was the very first question I got?
Religion.
No. Oh, was that the first? That's not the one I mean.
No.
Washington never spoke about the details of his religion.
Re-entering public life, is that?
Oh, yeah, that's it. This is kind of obscure, but that is the question I'm thinking of. Washington does re-enter into public life. There's a uniform on display at the Smithsonian. They're finally admitting what it is. They used to tell you that it was the uniform that Washington wore during the Revolution, and it doesn't. It just can't be. The small clothes might be, the waistcoat and the breeches, but the coat, it's the same as it. Basically, it's the blue and buff like he wore during the war. But you see the collar I'm wearing now? Mm-hmm. This is called a rise and fall collar, and there's one very, very noticeably on the coat at the Smithsonian. That's not a 1770s coat. That can't be any earlier than a 1780s coat, and it's very likely a 1790s coat. And as I'm about to explain, it is certainly a 1790s coat. Who's our second president? Adams. Washington does Adams a huge disservice. It gets worse during Adams, but it starts during Washington, and that is that we almost go to war with France. We end up in a period that's called the quasi-war. And most people will, the issues that started are under Washington, but it gets out of hand and almost becomes a war under Adams. And so Adams starts preparing the army for the possibility of that quasi-war becoming a real war. And his plan is to call on our hero. So he has plans to make Washington lieutenant general, call him out of retirement, and put him in charge of the army. Washington is getting older. I should mention that Adams is a Federalist, and his party is divided between two Federalists. I often, some of you have heard me say this. I know you guys have probably heard me say this. I'm often, when I talk about my cabinet, I refer to my Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of the State as being the heads of the two political parties. The Federalists aren't that well organized, actually. The Federalists have two heads. They have two competing heads that don't agree with each other and who have different pulls on the public. And it's Adams and Hamilton. And so when Washington hears that they're going to make him or talking about asking him to be lieutenant general, he says, I will, but because of my advanced age, I will not take the field, and I will only accept the position if I am allowed to commission my generals. And so all of Adams's supporters say, don't give it to Washington. Because who's Washington going to make the actual field commander? He's going to make Hamilton. And if the war happens, and if it's successful, and Hamilton becomes a war hero, what's going to happen to his political clout? Yeah. So what does Adams do? He makes Washington lieutenant general, and Washington does exactly what people warned him. He immediately elevates Hamilton. The uniform that's on display at the Smithsonian is Washington's lieutenant general uniform. He does come out of retirement. Well, in reality, like I said, he was going to stay at home anyway. So is that fully out of retirement? And in reality, it never happens. In fact, some historians don't even believe we were that close to war. I don't agree with them. I'm going to tell you that. But I also, particularly when I'm out of character, when I'm in character, I'm supposed to be living up to the biases and opinions of my character. I try to be pretty neutral when I'm out of character. And so the argument that those historians make is that the quasi-war was blown out of proportion by the Federalists to try to keep power. That may be true. It's also true that the Democratic Republicans were very pro-France, though the quasi-war helps destroy that too. It's not, I mentioned earlier the huge support during Washington's presidency that there was for the French. The French end up deteriorating that really quickly into Adams as president. They end up losing that, sometimes because of illegal actions they were taking here during Washington's presidency. But the war, luckily, doesn't happen because I don't think it would have gone well for it. It may have. Who knows? there's a great quote from the next war where the French are our friends again. They're not involved in the war. Well, they're kind of manipulating us into the war because they've got their own war going on with Britain at the time, and that's 1812. And there's a great quote, Cochrane, who is a brilliant British admiral. How many of you have ever seen the movie Master and Commander? How many of you have actually read the books? Any of you here are actually Patrick O'Brien fans? I'm a big Patrick O'Brien fan myself. And the main character in that book, there's two main characters, but the captain, Aubrey, is based on Cochrane, who I'm about to explain. And Cochrane was one of the naval commanders here during the War of 1812. And one of the Americans at the Battle of Bladensburg, when D.C. is burned, one of the Americans says to him, you wouldn't have taken this city if Washington were still alive and were still president. And Cochrane said, if Washington was still president, we wouldn't even be in this war.
I read recently that Hancock really pressed Massachusetts to ratify the Constitution based on a promise that if Virginia didn't, eliminating Washington from the ability to be president, then Hancock would then be placed into the Constitution, would have been elected as judge.
I haven't heard that, and it sounds like a confusion of what actually happens earlier.
It's in
when Hancock is
tell
president.
You where it comes from, if you want.
I'm
now blanking on. Is it Kostler, the guy who? It's a book called 1789 about a confluence of world events all occurring around.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think Hancock was that strong by that point. He might have been. I'm not sure that it would have gone that way anyway because of what happens to Rhode Island. But then again, what happened to Rhode Island may not have been able to happen if 12 other states hadn't ratified the Constitution by then. Because Washington almost goes to war with Rhode Island. Rhode Island is coerced into ratifying the Constitution. Now, would that have happened to Virginia? Virginia was 10th. So there would have been less ability to do that sort of thing with only 9. And it definitely less without Virginia's money and population. You kind of lose track of that sometimes today, how important Virginia's role was in the period. Part of that's because it's going to deteriorate pretty quickly. Actions that Virginia takes ends up changing Virginia's role. And Virginia goes from being the power of the South. I mean, they're still financially the power. They're still manpower-wise the power. But the city that represents the South's interests more directly than Richmond ends up being Charleston. And you see the direct result of that when we go into the Civil War, where Richmond's eventually made the capital, but it's almost a bribe. Because again, they still need the power and the money, and frankly, at that point, Virginia has the beginnings of an industrial culture already starting because that's what Richmond always did. Before Richmond was the capital, when it was first founded, it was iron mines and foundries. And so we often don't think of that too, because we think of the South all being farms, but Richmond had an industrial base and had it pretty early on. In fact, other countries were I didn't know this until very recently. In fact, I thought Tredegar Iron Works was a result of the Civil War, but it was actually providing foreign powers with iron previous to the Civil War.
Yes. Did Washington's Masonic affiliation influence him anyway through his life? And were there such a thing as Masonic military lodges?
Yes, there still are. And at least one of them dates from then. The rules are a little different on how traveling lodges work today. It was a lot easier in those days, but for a traveling lodge to meet in the jurisdiction of another Grand Lodge, it has to get permission. I don't think it's ever denied, but that happens. Most of the military lodges that still survive from the period, there's a few of them, but most of them aren't traveling anymore. They've become regular standing lodges with charters from the Grand Lodge.